Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's SANS Threat Analysis Rundown live stream version. My name is Katie Nichols. I'm an instructor at the SANS Institute as well as Director of Intelligence for Red Canary. Super excited to be back this month after a little spring break last month to dive into all of the recent threat news. There is a lot to talk about. And I am so thrilled to be joined this month by Zach Stanford, who's a lead investigator at the firm CyberCX and also a contributor to the DFIR report, one of my absolute favorite sources blogs right now. So, Zach, how's it going? Tell us a little bit about yourself and welcome.
Hey, thanks so much. I'm from CyberCX, which is an Australian company. We do quite a lot of different types of incidents. But my background basically started in a SOC, did a whole lot of detection, engineering, and then kind of moved towards to DFIR, where I am now.
Excellent. And so CyberCX, right, during the day, and I should note,
Yeah.
Zach is dialing in from Australia, so it's really early there. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's all
And
good. Yeah, definitely early here. Yeah.
as so many of us, right, we got two jobs, many jobs. Also, a contributor for the DFIR report. For people who aren't familiar, could you tell us a little bit about the DFIR report, what that is, kind of what you do there?
Yeah, look, we're a bunch of analysts from quite a different variety of backgrounds. Some of us are engineers, some of us are sysadmins, others are, security analysts or responders like myself. But essentially, we're trying to provide reports that, provide quite a lot more transparency or actionable intel to our readers, which we hope anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, actionable, right, on the ground intrusion reporting, I think is one that's really, really, it's tough to find. And so I forget how long you've been around for. Over a year, though. I remember when I first saw the DFIR report, I was super excited, right? And you all can follow along with us as we discuss this latest post that just came out earlier this week on iced ID and quantum ransomware. So you can follow along the dfirreport.com. I guess the first question I have, and this is something that, right, my team struggles with as well, writing these reports can be a lot of work, right? Doing the intrusion analysis, and then figuring out how do I communicate this in a way that someone else can understand. Can you tell us a little bit about, right, the process of doing that? I know that, right, you're kind of the lead on this, and you have other contributing analysts. How do you go about writing these, and how long does that take you?
Yeah, look, definitely, we start as, where most incidents start, where it's discovered, right? So whether that's, encrypted files or detections, but basically we have to, pull threads from there and work back. And obviously, our kind of, our big thing that we have in our reports is the timeline, and we definitely focus that on that a lot. But basically, depending on how, big or complex the environment is, it could take weeks or even months before you see, the end product that you see beforehand. But typically how it works is that, the team has a lead and we split up analysis depending on how many analysts we have. But, the better we can tell that story, I think the more helpful it is to analysts or to our readers. Yeah.
I love what you said about telling a story. I think
Yeah.
that's one of the most effective ways of explaining intrusions, but trying to do
Absolutely.
that is not easy, right? As you said, like sometimes you'll start at the end and then you have to piece it together. I saw someone ask this before on Twitter. How do you create these timelines? Do you have like a special magic tool, or is it just like, is it really a lot of work?
Oh, look, simple answer. It's just Xmind, with
Oh,
just a
nice.
lot of work. Yeah, look, we use it a lot. It's one of those things that you probably notice a lot in all our reports, with our kind of timelines or our process diagrams and things like that. It's just a visual way to display information that's a lot more, I guess, ingestible for the reader.
So much easier. So that's good to know.
Yeah.
It's Xmind mind mapping software, just a creative use of it. And that's one of the things I think that struck me when I first started reading reports from the DFIR report is like, I love this timeline. Like you said, just conveying a lot of info really simply. So can you walk us through a little bit of what were the parts of this intrusion that you outlined on the blog here?
Yeah, look, it probably is more of a standard intrusion. There are definitely bits that we thought were really interesting, especially the bits about the commodity malware turning into ransomware. Obviously, we've seen time and time again, commodity malware like ICE-ID, like Emotet, Chickbot, all of those ones have a relationship with ransomware groups, and this is a really good example of that. So we really saw almost like a line in the sand of where it started with ICE-ID, and then a bit more hands-on keyboard activity. So that was really nice to map out, and obviously providing a full time timeline from start to finish is super helpful. Sometimes you might get parts, and especially coming in after a ransomware, evidence may not be great either. So getting that full image is really good.
Yeah, and something you mentioned, right, this is something I've talked about, and I'm sure you see a lot, right? You have that initial access broker, malware like ICE-ID in this case, and then a pass off to the ransomware operators themselves. I'm curious, are you able to figure out where that handoff is? Like, how do you make that assessment? That's something that I know is tough when you're just looking at logs. How do
Yeah,
you think through
absolutely.
that?
I think the key one for this was a clear distinction between automated and manual techniques. So
Mhm.
even just process times, right? Say you see a bunch of process times, maybe net commands, maybe IP config commands, all in within a second. Obviously, you can quite
Mhm.
safely assume that's automated. And then when you start to see the spawn of Cobalt Strike, in this case, for example, and then really spacing out the process times and kind of going to more of an interactive approach, I would say. And that's really how you can distinguish it as well, especially when that Cobalt Strike beacon spawns, that really defines the next kind of stage of the attack.
Yeah, and I think this timeline's a great representation, right? 1857 UTC, you have, what is this, like close to 10 commands,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
probably not typing those in manually, but then you get to like, okay, 2043, your initial injection of Cobalt Strike, which we see so commonly in ransomware intrusions. And then
Absolutely.
like, I think this is an interesting, thing to point out about the discovery commands, right? There were discovery commands at 1857, but then at 2044, maybe like more thoughtful ones.
Exactly
Is
right.
that
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
suggesting maybe that's hands-on keyboard?
Absolutely. Yeah. I would say almost certainly that iced ID is almost like a check-in, I would say. Once they check in, the malware would run those commands, get a bit more of information about the domain or whatever environment they're in, and then move from there. So definitely the AD finds part and doing a bit more poking around the network is definitely something different.
And so, mentioned a lot of aspects of this do feel very similar, right? For anyone who's tracked ransomware intrusions, you got your crimeware, you got your discovery commands, you got your Cobalt Strike, credential dumping. I'm curious, were there any techniques or procedures, anything that kind of struck you as like, this is particularly interesting in this intrusion, or something new or novel?
Yeah, look, I would, if I'm totally honest, I would say none of these techniques are super new or unique. We
Mhm.
see them, time and time again. We've seen even other groups use absolutely exactly the same, if not playbook by playbook copies of these kind of techniques. However, there was that one part in the report where the actor basically leaked their host name. So in RDP logs, sometimes you can leak your host name. It could be their VM, it could be a total false flag, but it's still good to kind of document and record going forward. As yeah, honestly, I wouldn't be able to tell you straight away where it is. There it is. Oh no. But essentially, some RDP logs basically leak the source host name of the device even afterwards. Um, I think it's part of comms.
I'll try to find it
Um,
later, but yeah,
yeah,
if you,
sorry.
there's a
Yeah,
lot to
look,
read here.
yeah, it's interesting to know we see them leak quite a lot. Yeah, there it is. Sorry,
There it
that makes
is.
more sense. So totally
Interesting.
could just be a VM name, could be something else, but still interesting to note down and record, especially after a long period of time. If that gets reused in other intrusions, that's something that gets a little bit more interesting.
Nice. That's a really interesting one to call out. Something as I'm teaching, right? Thinking about looking for human fingerprints. That's something I always emphasize for Intel analysts, and there's this interesting, I think, divide sometimes between like incident response people and intel analysts, but
Yeah,
I would argue, right, everything you do is intel, right? Like this is
absolutely.
intelligence, right? Pulling
Yeah.
out this interesting workstation name and being like, hey, have we seen that before? Can we correlate this to anything else? Could that be like an adversary fingerprint? So
Yeah,
yeah, interesting
all adds
aspect.
up, right? It's all those little bits of information that add up to kind of basically a profile. And the other one of note is the linked the .link files. So and the execution part at the start, the delivery payload was basically an ISO file, an image that in the containment that contained basically a .lnk file as well as a DLL file. But the interesting thing about link files is they actually have way more information than basically just the shortcut commands. So if you go into the execution part,
Hmm. Scrolling down.
sorry, yeah, just a little bit further.
Oh, good. A lot of screenshots here. While we're on the ISO though,
Yeah,
I've seen a decent number of actors starting to use ISOs, like
yeah,
bizarre ISO, right?
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
curious what your thoughts are. Like, why do you think they're shifting to ISOs? It's something that I've definitely noticed. Have you seen
It's
the
all about
same?
it's all about detection. I think anything containerized is just that one layer of abstraction for detection. Any kind of obviously we see a lot of password zips as well, so that's totally encrypted. So no matter what you do or what fancy software you have, that's not going to be detected. So I think that's one of the ways that they try and get past the delivery a little bit more. And it's all about getting that percentage through on their phishing, how many things they can get through all of these fancy tools.
So look for ISOs for sure.
Yeah,
But then,
even
right,
just
as we
block them.
talked about,
Honestly, I don't think many people would be sending ISOs to each other. But if
I
you
would
are,
hope
then
not. You always say this should never happen though, and then it does. So
exactly. Yeah.
so within that ISO, you're saying, okay, so LNK and DLL, and I think this is what you're saying, that there's some interesting kind of properties of
Yeah,
the LNK file.
yeah. So people obviously that have a bit more of a forensic background know that these files actually have quite a lot more data than maybe the shortcut that it's representing. But it even records things like the host name and the MAC address of the actual source computer that's created on, as well as the path that it's created on. So here you can see users.admin or /admin, sorry. That's obviously a very boring name, but sometimes you get really cool stuff. So very occasionally you might have a link file that actually gives you quite that extra, maybe has a unique name, and then you can use that as part of your intelligence.
Nice. I love that. Another place to look for like human fingerprints or like workstation name, MAC
Absolutely.
address. Sounds like you used an Eric Zimmerman tool, another SANS instructor. He has all the
Yes,
cool
yes,
forensics tools,
I
LECMD. So
know.
super easy to pull that out and look at that link LNK metadata. Nice. So thinking about other aspects of this intrusion, right? Some were very similar, like this DLL register server in the run DLL 32 command line. Definitely, I've seen that in intrusions
Excellent.
before. That's an uncommon one. Might be useful for detection potentially. But one of the things looking at that timeline was kind of how quick this was. I think it was under 4 hours from ICE ID to encryption with quantum ransomware. I'm curious your thoughts. Like, that seems fast. Do you have a sense of like, is that anomalous? Like, in the ransomware intrusions you've seen, how quick is that in comparison to others?
Yeah, well, it's definitely on the quick side for sure, but I think it's probably largely up to what type of attacks that they're undertaking. So whether it's double extortion or just encryption, and then smash and grab kind of style. So obviously double extortion is you get data, exfil it, and then host it and hold it ransom as well as the encryption. And that takes time. That really does take quite a lot of time. So typically we see uh, uh, if there is exfil, that's the time that they're sitting and basically waiting. I've seen actors wait days and days for that to sync up over like a tiny internet link just because their upload speed is really bad, before they basically detonate the ransomware. So that's a big throttle on their I guess their timeline. So we didn't actually see any exfil in this case, and I think that plays a large part to why it was so quick. However, I would say that the actors are becoming more streamlined with their attacks, regardless of exfil. It's a fast attack. It really is pretty fast. So defenders obviously have to act pretty fast in comparison as well. If you have that first detection maybe at the top of the chain, do you think you could basically protect in 4 hours? Essentially, is the question I'd be asking.
Yeah, and that's why I say this over and over, but I'm going to say it again. Like, don't ignore detections or alerts for things like iced ID or Emotet or similar family. It's just you're like, oh, that's just crimeware. Like, less than 4 hours later, you could have
Oh yeah.
ransomware. Um, but I think what's interesting, I never really thought about the exfiltration, right? The double extortion you mentioned, sort of slowing actors down. So I've always thought of that as like, oh, this is terrible because they're stealing our data. Now they're going to make us pay, right? Or they're going to leak it. But maybe in terms of buying time, that exfiltration is actually a positive. Maybe especially your network speeds are really slow. And so adversaries
Yeah.
are just frustrated by your slow network. I don't
Uh,
know. That's interesting.
it, I've seen, so obviously I know Red Canary has also reported on a
Mhm.
huge amount of R clone or just syncing of data up to dodgy services like Mega. I wouldn't say dodgy, but definitely one of the ones that being used the most in Xfil to store data. But that really slows it down if they basically target, say, a 1 terabyte share drive or something like that, and maybe not have their filters tuned properly. A lot of the time, they try to filter files on specific extensions that they really want to target, but if they mess that up, it actually ends up being really bad for their timeline.
It's interesting. Yeah, and I was just bringing up one of the blog posts my teammates did, right? Mentioning
Yeah,
like
yeah.
some of these sources like Mega Sync, using that for this double extortion. So
If you see Mega on your network, it's generally not a bad and not a good sign, unless you're using it, but I doubt it.
yeah, unauthorized, it might be dodgy. I like the word
Yeah,
dodgy. I feel like it's a polite
dodgy.
version of
Yeah,
shady, right?
yeah,
But no exfiltration here, which is interesting, maybe contributing to the speed there. But definitely encryption with quantum ransomware. And I'm curious, right? Quantum, when I saw that, I was like, wait, I don't think I've heard of this one before. Like, not a super household name, maybe like, something like Conti. I'm
yeah.
curious, how common is quantum? What have you seen it before this? Like anything else, about the quantum ransomware piece?
Yeah, this ransomware in particular picked up speed definitely at the start of this year,
Hmm.
but you may recognize it. It seems to be an offshoot of Mount Locker, which was a lot more popular in the last couple of years. And that's the thing that kind of tied the techniques together as well. We also saw other rebrands of that same group, like Zinglocker and Astrolocker, share a lot of similarities with Quantum. So even their binaries are very similar. Their victim chat portals, their DSLs, their dedicated leak sites, they're all very similar, if not clones of each other. So that kind of ties into how obviously we see groups brand quite uh, quickly these days.
Mhm.
But I mean, I even noticed some Yara rules for Mount Locker that still work on the Quantum ransomware. So that goes to show how much code reuse they do and how similar it is.
Interesting. Well, that makes me feel better because it's like I'm so out of it. I've never heard of Quantum. I've heard of Mount Locker, and so
Yes,
another
yeah.
example, right? Maybe a potential rebrand. I see now Quantum Locker, so that makes more sense. You have to use the word locker in ransomware. It's like grab
Yeah.
bag of how you name your ransomware, right? And that's one thing I'd point out, like to your point about a lot of these techniques, right? Same living off the land binaries, same discovery commands. Like, if these adversaries are just rebranding, like it is annoying to have to keep track of all these names, but the good news is they're repeating techniques. So I'd argue that's not good for defenders, right? Seeing the same kind of things that are repeated across all the intrusions that a DFA report has covered. If you focus on those, you're gonna have a pretty darn good chance of intercepting these intrusions, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it obviously there are uses of malware. I don't we rarely have a case that doesn't have Cobalt Strike in it. But the other ones are a little bit more, a bit harder to detect, like admin utilities like AD Find, the IP scanners that go into that gray area of potentially used by admins. But the other one that we've noticed that is really becoming a standard in these toolkits is remote monitoring tools, or management tools. So things like AnyDesk, Atira, Splashtop, TeamViewer. I mean, they're basically enterprise approved Trojans to access endpoints. So really, knowing which ones are supposed to be installed and on your network and not supposed to be installed is definitely a good thing to know. They're becoming almost standard, while not in this intrusion, but becoming almost standard in most ransomwares that we're seeing at the moment.
I will +1 that, right? Atira, AnyDesk.
Yes,
Never,
yeah.
never good. Like just looking for those, if they shouldn't be on your network and you don't legitimately use them, might be a sign because they're super convenient for adversaries to deploy ransomware.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's not going to be picked up by an AV or an EDR, so it's perfect.
Yep. Getting some love. Huge fan of the DEFA report. Lee saying, I am too. Appreciate everything you share. If anyone has questions for Zach, feel free to drop those in. One other question, right? I'm setting up for the end of the report here. Also, shout out, I appreciate the addition of the diamond model as an Intel person here. And I love how you map that host name to adversary as a human fingerprint there. Um, there are so many ways people could use this report. What are some of the key ways you'd recommend if someone's like, cool, I want to defend against iced ID in this chain? How could they action this report?
Yeah, I think it definitely depends on what kind of, I guess, defender you are, whether that might be, say, a detection engineer. So hopefully we provide enough information, maybe that's the command lines or the series of um, of commands to create potentially correlation alerts or something that you could put in your SIEMs. Even if you're just a SOC analyst, maybe you see that first alert at ICE ID and you do take it a little bit more seriously, or you know what to look for afterwards. And being exposed, maybe a general SOC analyst might not see a ransomware every day. So being exposed to that full attack chain is something that is super valuable. And when I was a SOC analyst, this stuff would have been absolutely awesome. So yeah, but even people like that they're in the DFIR space or Intel space, I'm sure at keeping up to date with all of these groups and these TTPs is basically a full-time job in itself. So any kind of resource that basically has that detail, I think is very useful. Yeah.
Question coming in from Kyle. Do you have a list of common adversarial tools, like outside of lol bins, things like AnyDesk that adversaries might use? I'm trying to think. I don't think I've seen like a centralized list like that. Have you seen
No,
anything like that?
I might be able to work on that actually. It'll be something to put together. Yeah.
Nice.
Uh,
Yeah.
as a start, the DFIR report put out a year in review, and that basically has a list of a lot of those tools that maybe not they're not quite classified as logins or malware. They're more just, I would say, grayware. But yeah, a lot of those are utilities that can be used to gain a certain kind of edge in the network, and we see those all the time. Yeah, that diagram is really good.
Nice. Y'all are really good at diagrams. So, I mean, yeah, Kyle's compiling a list on GitHub. Like maybe this could be a community type resource, but this is a great starting
Perfect.
point.
Yeah.
And I love the kind of the mapping of different tools used during these intrusions. So great question. Let's see, other things to point out in this report, right? You mentioned, and I agree, like so many of these command lines, like I called out like DLL register server in the run DLL32 command line. That could be great for detection. You all also have at the end a ton of different actionable info that I wanted to call out, right? You've got the hash values, the indicators for people who want those. Awesome. You got network indicators for ICE ID, Cobalt Strike. You have the Cobalt Strike details. And then you also have some various intrusion detection signatures that might match and Sigma rules, which are awesome. I'm curious, Are you the one who writes Sigma rules? Is that someone else on your team?
Oh, so a lot of the time we use the open a lot of our software we use is basically open source, and we try to use the community resources as much as we can. So Florian Roth's repository that he maintains, we use heavily. And if we do add extra ones, so whether that's a Yara rule or anything like that, then we'll say that it was ours. But most of the time, it's generally it's open source, and we'll contribute back when we can.
Love it. Yeah, if someone else has or a rule that makes sense, right? A define keeps being used. I
Yeah,
love that. So if you're not familiar, right, Sigma rules, you can translate these into a bunch of different SEM tools, ideally. So kind of a central format. Um, so yeah, Hamid, I will share all the links out later on. But these Sigma rules, they shared that link earlier, just at the bottom of this awesome report. So Wade asking any tips on writing reports and making these diagrams? Like you all have this down. What would you say to people who are trying to write awesome reports like yours?
I think it's definitely to do with what audience you're writing for, and I think that's always a thing with DFIL reports. You can go quite high level, you can go into quite a lot of detail, but really what we're writing for is what we really wanted to see, maybe something that we didn't really see at the time, and really just going in as deep as we can and providing as much information as we can in a fairly structured way. So obviously we try to use MITRE and all of those things that we generally use. But yeah, shout out to XMind, I guess. The diagrams is the cheat way. Yeah.
I love that, right? Maybe some people have access to graphic artists, some people don't. And so using
Yeah. Yeah.
mind mapping software, using right PowerPoint slides, something like that. But I love what you said about thinking about your audience, right? You clearly are writing for like other security practitioners to help them be able to protect against stuff like this and thinking about, right, how could you communicate the command line detail? I think thinking about audience is a great tip. And then using the tools you have and right? Even if you don't have, I don't know, fancy tools or a whole lot of resources, you can do a lot with a mind map, an awesome
Absolutely.
timeline. So
Yeah.
great example of that. Thinking about audience, and I love also right thinking about what's the structure or the framework you use, whether it's MITRE ATT&CK. I appreciate this is something my team does as well. Breaking down your sections by tactic, MITRE ATT&CK tactic, or by phase, really helpful. I think it just helps people follow along as well.
Yeah, it's basically that story writing almost, right? It's that initial point, and you're going through. I mean, if we wrote in the way that we investigated, it would be all over the place. So it probably wouldn't be a great read.
Yes, telling a story to bring it full
Yeah.
circle to what you said at the beginning, telling the story of an intrusion. Awesome. Well, anything else to add about this? Anything else the audience should know about iced ID or quantum?
Look, I would say is it's I know it's hard, but making sure that you have those protections in place for just those kind of basic things, whether that's look, MFA or even just exposed servers on the internet, making sure they're all patched. A lot of the time, you'll see in our reports the initial access as well as vulnerability. So not only we have maybe phishing as the initial vector, but other times we have obviously last year was exchange was crazy. So we see a whole lot of different types of intrusion or initial access vectors. But at the end of the day, it is substantially, as you can see in that graph, is towards phishing and user endpoints. So making sure that user endpoint space is not only protected but maybe even educated as well.
Yeah, and I think we were talking about how hey, a lot of these techniques and tools are used in ransomware intrusions many times, but they're used because they're effective, right? I think adversaries will continue using those as long as they work, and they clearly did in this case, and they work in a lot of different intrusions. So I think that's a great point.
Yeah, they're always adapting. I would say if something does get squashed, they will try to figure out the next big thing. But if something works, they're going to use it, and that's just the bottom line, really. That they want to make money as fast as possible, so they're just going to use stuff that works.
Absolutely. As we're wrapping up here, again, wanted to thank you, Zach, for all you and your teammates have done at the DFIR report. I don't usually do this, but right, this is a group of researchers who are right out there just trying to help people. You're not a multi-billion-dollar company, so you can actually get access to artifacts. Right, I think it's a couple bucks on a Patron site. So other services you have as well as a feed, but so much just available for free on that blog post. And so, Zach, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for all you and your teammates are doing.
No, thank you so much. Thanks for having me, Katie.
Awesome. Take care. Hopefully you can get some rest, go back to sleep, get some mineral
Going to sleep
complex
now
early
straight
on.
away.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Zach. Cool. Well, so awesome having him on. I remember when I first saw the DFIR report, I don't think any of them even gave their real names, and now a few of them are saying, "Yep, this is us." So really awesome resource. If you aren't familiar with it, go check out the DFIR report. All of their amazing services. All right. So iced ID, quantum, one thing to talk about, but now I want to just talk about so many of the other things that are going on in the threat landscape. I know, shockingly, when I was preparing, I was like, "Oh, there's not much to talk about," and then I started pulling apart all of the things to talk about, and there's a lot. So just hitting a couple things that I've seen in the last couple weeks that are worth talking about, and all of these links I will send out a summary later. So don't worry, I will send all the links out for you. The first area I wanted to kind of hit on is annual report season. I mentioned when we last talked a couple months ago, CrowdStrike had their annual report that came out on the last couple of weeks. Mandiant has also released theirs, M-Trends 2022. And I'm a huge fan of these annual reports. Shout out to the teams who do them, right? 95 pages in M-Trends. These are not an easy lift, right? A huge lift for analysts, for graphics, for design teams. But I think they're great to kind of compare what your team's been tracking with what other teams are seeing as well, right? Learning about some different actors maybe you're not familiar with and seeing what kind of overall trends in the community there are. M-Trends, I think they did a really awesome job. They always do in like breaking down graphics. And one of their key metrics that they often will include is the dwell time. Often one that people will keep an eye on, right? Number of days an attacker's in an environment before they're detected. And so good news, from 2020 to 2021, the median dwell time decreased by 3 days. So I don't know, I'm optimistically hoping that that means defenders are getting a little bit better. So decrease in dwell time. We collectively kicked adversaries out 3 days earlier, which is great. In an intrusion like we saw with Quantum, 21 days, you're already going to be ransomed. So unfortunate, but hey, that's the average dwell time. We're maybe getting better. Yep, and as promised, I will share out the links later on. One interesting aspect of dwell time, though, is how do people find out about their compromises? You can see this breakdown from Mandiant, external versus internal, right? External meaning that somebody else outside of your org told you about it. And you can see like a lot of the notifications remain external. Someone else in the community, I assume this would be like government or private sector, everyone notifying someone. So that's an interesting takeaway. Maybe a challenge for defenders to try to find things ourselves a little bit better. So 95 pages in M-Trends, a lot to pull out here. I think this is great if you have like a plane ride or something. Good reading on a dedicated time, a lot to pull out of that annual report. I also wanted to mention my team's annual threat detection report. We have a bunch of detail. There's a web version as well as a PDF version because I like PDFs. Lots of details here, different trends we saw around ransomware, supply chain, a breakdown of different threats we've seen, and detection opportunities on all of those, right? So various malware families like Gootkit's one we've seen quite a bit of, and like the DFIR report folks, we want to share how to detect these things. So Red Canary's threat detection report, another annual report worth looking at. And then a third annual report I just wanted to hit was from Project Zero, a team at Google, Maddie Stone, big fan of hers. It talked about 0 days that they've found exploited in the wild. And so a lot of 0 days last year, right? Disclosure of 58 in the wild 0 days, the most ever recorded since Project Zero began tracking in mid 2014. And so the question there is like, is this good? Is this bad? Well, all right, they're talking about number of 0 day exploits detected and disclosed in the wild. And so maybe this is actually a positive, right? As Maddie talks about here, the fact that the community collectively, Google Project Zero is getting better at identifying when adversaries are exploiting or using these 0 day exploits. So interesting piece of news. And I think, as we're looking at any of these metrics for years, always important to think about the different reasons why things might be the case. Like initially, you're like, oh my gosh, 58 in the wild 0 days detected. Like everything is broken and everything is terrible. Maybe it's also good because they're getting better. The community is getting better at finding in the wild use. So just a few annual reports to hit and probably some others coming out. As I mentioned, these take a long time. So once you have your 2021 data, you have to actually analyze it and then put a report out. So definitely recommend checking all of those out. Moving on, ICS had a big April, right? The industrial control system community. I wanted to hit on these. I'm not tracking ICS threats every day, but there were two kind of key malware families that were disclosed. And I wanted to talk about this in part because it was really confusing. The week of April 13th, especially if you weren't an ICS person who's like reading all these reports, you're like, what is happening? There were actually two different ICS malware families disclosed the same week. And Robert M. Lee, my colleague, lead instructor for SANS Forensics 578, kind of summarized this well and why this was so important, right? Before the week of April 13th, the ICS community knew about 5 known ICS malware families, right? Families that were specifically targeting industrial control systems. And then the week of April 13th, they found 2 more, right? So that's a pretty significant increase. And so the really important thing that everyone was confused about, right? 2 different families. One known as Indestroyer 2, and then the other one known as Pipe Dream. So the first one, just to kind of summarize this, Indestroyer 2. Blog posts came out from both ESET as well as Mandiant. Indestroyer V2, ESET came out with this initially the week of April 13th, and then Mandiant just came out with theirs this week, I believe, diving into more details in Destroyer V2. This one was actually seen targeting a Ukrainian energy company. And so what was the positive about this one, right? ESET, the Ukrainian CERT, worked together and they were able to actually stop this. It was seen in an energy company, able to analyze this attack and look at this malware. So again, Indestroyer 2 was actually seen in an energy company in Ukraine. Interesting aspect of this one is that ESET associated this activity back to a group called Sandworm, which is believed to be associated with the Russian government. There's an awesome book by Andy Greenberg called Sandworm. If you haven't read it, great reading that kind of tracks the history of this group. This group was behind previous attacks against the energy sector in Ukraine in 2015 and 2016 that led to a lot of power outages, actually. So you might have heard of Sandworm before. Looks like they are back with Indestroyer 2 malware. So again, that was seen in an electric company, energy company in Ukraine. ESET blog post, Mandiant blog post. I mentioned Andy Greenberg wrote the book on Sandworm, literally. He has a great piece just kind of explaining how, right, suspected Russian adversaries, this Sandworm group, tried to take down power in Ukraine. So a good summary from Andy. So that's the first malware family, ICS malware family. Indestroyer 2. The second one is known as Pipe Dream or In Controller by Dragos and Mandiant. And so it was super confusing. I don't know about you, but that week I was like, is this all the same? Nope. Indestroyer 2 different. That was actually seen in an energy company in Ukraine versus In Controller or Pipe Dream. What's cool about this is that various companies, right, including Dragos, Mandiant, US government cooperated and they were able to find this malware family before it was used in the wild. And so, right, thinking about why do people release reports? What do they mean? Well, the US Department of Homeland Security actually released a report on this malware family. And right, whenever the US government releases something, sometimes you think about, hey, is there another goal or objective? Well, since researchers were able to find this family before it was even used, this was pretty awesome because DHS, Dragos, Mandiant were able to release all of the details before it was actually observed causing damage. So kind of a neat win. And I think this is a great example of public-private cooperation, right? Directly in the DHS report, they give a shout out to the various companies, right, that were involved here, and they actually link to the Dragos and the Mandiant report. So again, this one known by different names, Ink Controller by Mandiant, and then Pipe Dream by Dragos. But this one they caught before it was used anywhere known in the wild. So kind of a cool week, a cool month for the industrial control system. Uh, all those researchers. So shout out to all of them. And if you're an ICS person, you're working on those networks, of course, worth looking at these reports, figuring out how to action them. If that's not you, still good to kind of be aware of what's going on with these new malware families that were identified. Of course, I mentioned the topic of Ukraine, right? In Destroyer 2 observed in an energy network in Ukraine. So let's pivot and talk a little bit about Ukraine. Really interesting situation, right? I had John Holtquist on months ago, and he was talking about, right, his team's preparation, his recommendation for hardening for destructive attacks. And since then, right, across the community, we've heard from USDHS, Shields Up has been the messaging. And from where I sit, it remains, it seems like it's still fairly regionally based. There have definitely been Russian and other cyber attacks on Ukraine. In fact, Microsoft just came out with a report like 2 hours ago about some of those. But it's been sort of interesting, and there are various opinions on what's going on there, right? How long can we keep our shields up? If you haven't seen it, 60 Minutes actually had a piece this past Sunday, April 17th, where they interviewed Jen Easterly, director of CISA. They interviewed Robert M. Lee, Lisa Monaco, Dmitry Alperovich. I would highly recommend kind of watching this or just reading this article, this summary, but summarizing kind of the challenge the U.S. government has here. That right, there's definitely, Russian cyber attacks going on in Ukraine, and their challenge in deciding, okay, could those affect US systems? So a couple weeks ago, right, you might have seen President Biden came out with this statement about, right, Russia could conduct malicious cyber activity, right, in late March. And the US government has said that they've kind of privately gone out and briefed companies and they've seen what they've called sort of reconnaissance activity, right? Preparation for other cyber attacks on US infrastructure. And so there's this huge challenge right now because I think generally there's agreement in the community that we have not seen like total cyber war on a global scale, right? There have definitely been cyber attacks against Ukraine, some of those attributed to Russia. There have definitely been wipers and other activity, but in the US, maybe other countries, we haven't seen really broad targeting. The question is that going to happen? And that's what a lot of analysts are trying to figure out right now. I think that the shields up message makes a lot of sense. But I would argue that as defenders, we should always have our shields up. So I think what I continue to watch for, right, and I said this a few months ago, is right, indications of widespread activity that are expanding outside Ukraine. I think that, right, there's definitely some warning. The US government has seen some signs that US critical infrastructure might be attacked. Dmitry Alperovich has highlighted this, and he talked about this in the 60 Minutes piece, and he said this on Twitter, right, that there might be retaliations for US sanctions or other countries' sanctions against Russia, economic sanctions, but they might retaliate in cyberspace. And so as defenders, I think we all have a really, really tough job. I think absolutely keeping the shields up, but at the same time, realizing that right? We might not see widespread cyber war, especially in the US and other countries, for a while. So it's a huge balance, a huge challenge. I did want to mention a report that as I said, just came out from Microsoft like 2 hours ago. Really excellent report. I just had time to skim it, talking about an overview of Russian cyber activity against Ukraine thus far. And so this is definitely going to be worth a read, especially if you're concerned about Russian activity, if you're concerned they might shift towards you, on kind of what we know so far. I appreciate they highlight the tracked malware families used for destructive activity in Ukraine. A lot of these wipers we've seen reporting on, in Destroyer 2 against industrial control systems. So this is a great report to read. And just think about, right, how can your organization prepare, especially if you're in Ukraine or have dependencies on Ukraine. So this is a tough one. I think as the community, right, we have to be thinking about how we can prepare while not, realizing, right, we can't be red alert all the time. It's a tough balance for all of us. So a couple, reading items for you, that Microsoft report that just came out, and then watching recommendations, 60 minutes. I think it's really interesting just to see how cybersecurity in general is kind of messaged to the public as well. So Ukraine will continue to watch and wait and see if there are signs of it expanding beyond Ukraine, where it seems like the cyber activity has been fairly limited to that region so far. Other items, kind of a grab bag of things I just wanted to point out. MITRE ATT&CK released a new version this week. So they release new versions every couple of months. And the one to highlight in this is that they have done a great job structuring approaches to detection. So there's a blog post kind of summarizing main changes. If your organization uses ATT&CK, would highly recommend reviewing that. Here's an example of what they did. So a couple years ago when I was on the ATT&CK team, we had this detection section for each of the techniques. So this one is for stealing or forging Kerberos tickets. And so it would just be like a wall of text, right? Talking about all the different detection approaches you could use for this technique. So the cool thing that the MITRE ATT&CK team did is they previously had data sources mapped. Here are the data sources that might help you detect this technique. And then what they did for this release was actually map out all of that prose stuff about detection, saying, okay, here's the data source, the data component that could help you detect it, and here's a description of how you could use that data source. So again, just really helpful to have this structured, because again, if as a defender you have Active Directory data, you can then go pivot into, right, what techniques could I potentially detect? You can see that, and then there's a description of exactly how to use that data source, which is, of course, the tough part. You have the data, and now you have to use it. So highly recommend checking out that MITRE ATT&CK update. A couple of neat new techniques as well. Beta version for ATT&CK ICS migration. So lots of work there from the MITRE ATT&CK team. A few other reports that I just wanted to briefly mention. Zach mentioned earlier, keeping track of these crimeware families like Iced ID that led to quantum ransomware. Another one, Emotet, has started to creep back a little bit. Proofpoint just put this out yesterday, pointing out a new delivery technique that Emotet uses. So Emotet has changed up their delivery vector in various ways over time. In this case, they were using OneDrive URLs and that initial phishing message. Then that would download a zip archive containing XLL files, which I will admit, I was not familiar with XLL files. A couple of other malware families recently started using XLL files. And the way I think of it as, it's basically an Excel DLL, right? XLL is the mental shortcut I used. And so there's some interesting kind of assessments here from Proofpoint about why these XLL files. Well, one assessment they make, which I think kind of makes sense, is that, right, adversaries like those developers of Emotet might be moving away from macro-enabled documents, right? So a lot of times we've seen actors like TA542 have macros in Microsoft Word or Excel documents, and that relies on users clicking enable macros. Well, a couple months ago, Microsoft said we're locking down, we're blocking macros by default in a lot of Office versions. And so, right, XLL files might be tempting or appealing to adversaries because they get around the need to use macros. So kind of an interesting one. And, I think this is an assessment. It's sort of more of a hypothesis right now, but we'll be watching. And so XLL files are something that I'd highly recommend if you're not already taking a look at weird XLL files in your environment, thinking about how you could detect emotet or other threats that are using those files. Then last but not least, again, in this sort of like crimeware to watch, this is a fairly new malware family called Bumblebee. This is a loader that has been seen in intrusions that have later led to Cobalt Strike. And so this is a blog from Max at Cynet. Max has also been tweeting a lot about Bumblebee. There are a few malware researchers talking about it, but it's not one I've seen a lot of discussion on. I think this is worth watching, in part because of what it leads to, right? Bumblebee leads in many intrusions to Cobalt Strike. And Max noted in this blog post that they haven't really seen the next stage, right? Anytime we see crimeware family plus Cobalt Strike, the kind of likely next step is ransomware. And so sort of a gap, I think, right now in, is Bumblebee pretty likely to lead to ransomware later on? I don't think the community knows for sure, but I think Bumblebee, this loader, is definitely worth keeping an eye on right now, because of what it could lead to. So blog post on that. There's some Twitter chatter about it. And then it was also mentioned in a post from Google on a group called Exotic Lily recently. So that's just a malware family that I would highly recommend keeping an eye on, in addition to the 11 billion other things that you have to track. Excellent. I think that was the last report that I wanted to hit. And again, I know that's a lot of info here. I'll wrap up all of these links and we'll share those later out. So just keep an eye on my Twitter and SANS Twitter, and we'll share these out so you can go and read all of these awesome things. As we start to wrap up, I just wanted to remind you of a couple upcoming events from the SANS perspective. We have a lot of SANS summits happening. Some of them are online, some of them are hybrid, in person and live online, which is pretty fun. One coming up in a few weeks is a neurodiversity and cybersecurity summit. I'm particularly excited about this one. There's a panel specifically geared for neurotypical people. Hey, here is what a group of neurodiverse folks want us to know about how to better support them. So that's one that I'm really excited about. This one's totally free online, the Neurodiversity and Cybersecurity Summit. The other one, if you care about ransomware, we talked about ransomware a lot today, quantum, other families. I'm actually co-chairing with my colleague Ryan Chapman a ransomware summit. It's going to be June 16th. This one is also free, virtual, online for you. So go ahead and register for that one. Actually, Zach's colleague, his teammate from CyberCX, Nick Klein, is going to be chatting with us. Some analysts from the DEFA report are also going to be giving kind of a year in review summary and talking about some of their intrusions. So ransomware summit in June, going to be really awesome. And then the last summit I wanted to highlight is the DEFA summit. This is a huge event. It's going to be, I believe, virtual and in person in Austin, Texas. So they're reviewing a bunch of proposals right now. This is the 15th year. Going to be a lot of fun. That's coming up in August. So if you want to be in Texas in August, DEFA Summit, worth keeping an eye on. If you want to just be in air conditioning somewhere else, you can also attend virtually. So lots of summits, lots of things coming up from the SANS perspective. And with that, that's all I've got for you all today. Thank you so much for joining me. So much thanks to Zach for joining us earlier from the DEFA report. With that, I hope everyone has a really wonderful rest of your day, and we hope to see you in a future instance of the SANS live stream. Have a great day, everyone.